Analytical table of contents. Hegel Science of Logic. Analytical table of contents. Note that the page numbers are embedded in the source code. For example, HL 182b means page 82 in Book 1 of the Science of Logic. Preface to the first edition 1. The complete transformation of philosophical thought in Germany has had little influence on logic. 2. When a nation loses its metaphysics, its own pure essence is no longer a present reality in the life of the nation. German philosophy has greatly changed in the last 25 years, but logic hasn't kept up. Metaphysics, which used to explore big questions like the soul and God, is no longer studied. People don't care about the form or content of metaphysics anymore. The author compares losing interest in metaphysics to losing interest in your country's identity. 3. Kantian philosophy was a justification for the renunciation of speculative thought. Kant's philosophy limited knowledge to experience, discouraging speculative thought, exploring big questions beyond experience. Modern education focused on practical skills, seeing theoretical knowledge as useless. Theology abandoned metaphysics, favoring emotions and historical facts. Solitary souls like philosophers were no longer valued, leading to a loss of contemplation and spirituality. Metaphysics is compared to the holy of holies, essential but missing in a cultured nation. The world seems more cheerful without the dark utterances of metaphysics, but the author implies a lack of depth. Overall, this passage argues that the decline of metaphysics in favor of practicality has made society less profound, even if it seems more pleasant on the surface. 4. As if one could only learn how to digest and move about by studying anatomy and physiology. Logic fared better than metaphysics. While some saw logic as just a tool for thinking, that view has been abandoned. The spirit of practicality didn't favor logic either. It seems practicality aimed to diminish logic's importance, similar to metaphysics. 5. Once the spirit has reconstituted itself, all attempts to preserve an earlier culture are utterly in vain. Logic is still taught but remains unchanged. It has practical uses but hasn't adapted to the new way of thinking in science and society. The author predicts a future change in logic. Just like new buds push off withered leaves, logic will eventually transform to reflect the new spirit of the times. 6. Even those who are opposed to the new ideas have become familiar with them and have appropriated them. Resistance to new ideas in philosophy is weakening. Even those opposing the new ideas are unknowingly influenced by them. Traditional philosophers are adapting. They may criticize the source of the new ideas, but they are incorporating them into their own thinking to stay relevant. 7. A new creative idea displays a fanatical hostility toward the entrenched systematization of the older principle. The initial excitement of the new philosophical ideas might be fading. The initial fervor of new ideas often involves criticizing the old system and avoiding complexities. The need for a more systematic approach is growing. Just like individuals, cultures need to develop new ideas into a more organized system for deeper understanding. Focus is shifting from acquiring new ideas to systematizing them. The priority is now to refine and structure these new philosophical concepts. 8. Philosophy, if it would be a science, cannot borrow its method from a subordinate science like mathematics. Logic, the core of metaphysics, has been neglected. The author emphasizes the importance of logic metaphysics, despite its lack of attention. The author is building a new foundation for logic. They acknowledge the challenge of creating a completely new approach to logic. Science should define its own methods. Philosophy, as a science, shouldn't rely on other disciplines or intuition for its methods. The nature of the content itself shapes the method. The author argues that the subject matter of philosophy, logic, metaphysics, will naturally lead to its own unique scientific method. Lenin. Focus on the process of knowledge. The core idea is about the movement of scientific cognition, which emphasizes the ongoing process of gaining knowledge. 2 faculties of thought. Hegel proposes 2 ways of thinking. Understanding, Verstand, this makes distinctions and categorizes things. Reason, Vernunft, this is critical and examines the contradictions within those categories. Reason is described as negative and dialectical because it breaks down the established categories of understanding. Synthesis through negation. The resolution comes through the combination of these two. Reason critiques understanding's categories, but this negation is not simply destructive. It leads to a new, more comprehensive understanding, positive. Unclear reference. The last part, negation of the simple movement of mind, seems to refer to additional ideas, but the context provided isn't enough to understand them fully. 9. Reason is negative and dialectical because it resolves the determinations of the understanding into nothing. Understanding versus reason. Understanding, Verstand, makes fixed categories and distinctions. Reason, Vernunft, negative and dialectical, breaks down understanding's categories, resolving them into nothing. This doesn't mean destroying them completely, but revealing their limitations. Positive creates a new, more comprehensive understanding by incorporating the insights from the negation. Synthesis, the movement of spirit. This back and forth between understanding and reason is the core of the dialectical method. It's a spiritual movement that leads to a deeper understanding. The result, concrete universals. This movement doesn't eliminate the particulars but places them within a broader, more complex framework, concrete universals. The dialectical method as the key to philosophy. Hegel argues that this self-correcting, dynamic approach is essential for philosophy to be a true science. It allows for objective knowledge by constantly refining understanding through critique and synthesis. Additional notes. The passage emphasizes that negative doesn't just mean destruction. It refers to the critical aspect that reveals limitations and opens the door for a richer understanding. The concept of spirit refers to a higher level of consciousness that incorporates both understanding and reason. In essence, Hegel's dialectical method is a dynamic process of thinking that uses both analysis, understanding, and synthesis, reason, to move towards a deeper and more comprehensive understanding of the world. Lenin, the path of self-construction. This refers to the dialectical method itself, where knowledge is built through a continuous process of critique and synthesis. Movement from ignorance to knowledge. The dialectic is seen as the key to achieving real understanding, moving from a state of not knowing to true knowledge. Connection to nature and spirit. The author emphasizes that this process of knowledge acquisition reflects a fundamental principle that exists in both the natural world and the development of consciousness, like the development of all natural and spiritual life. Pure essentialities. The bracketed German phrase, Natur der reinen Wesenheiten, translates to the nature of the pure essentialities. This likely refers to the underlying principles or truths that the dialectic method helps us uncover. 10. The development of all natural and spiritual life rests solely on the content of logic. Hegel's approach in the phenomenology of spirit. The author explains their attempt to understand consciousness in their book, Phenomenology of Spirit. Consciousness as concrete knowing. Consciousness is seen as a form of concrete knowing by spirit. It involves interaction with the external world. Development through logic. The development of both consciousness object and all natural and spiritual life is driven by the pure essentialities, which are the foundation of logic. Pure knowing and logic. As consciousness progresses and sheds its initial limitations, it reaches pure knowing. This involves understanding the pure essentialities themselves, which are essentially pure thoughts or the foundation of reason. The dialectical method as philosophy's core. The self-movement of these pure thoughts is considered the spiritual life of logic. This movement is what forms the core of philosophy and what philosophy aims to explain. Lenin. This sentence flips the script on the traditional way of thinking about logic and knowledge. Here's the new perspective. Traditionally, logic and the theory of knowledge, epistemology, were seen as providing the foundation for understanding the world. This passage suggests the opposite. Logic and epistemology should be derived from studying the development of all natural and spiritual life. In other words, we should observe how knowledge unfolds in nature and within ourselves to understand how logic and knowledge acquisition truly work. Here's an analogy. Imagine studying how birds fly to develop the principles of aerodynamics. This approach aligns with the idea of deriving logic from the development of all natural and spiritual life. 11. Logic is the first sequel to the phenomenology, to be followed by the philosophy of nature and the philosophy of spirit. Phenomenology of spirit. This is Hegel's earlier work that explores the development of consciousness. System of science. This is Hegel's larger philosophical project encompassing various disciplines. Logic's importance. The passage emphasizes the importance of logic as a foundation for the entire system of science. Publication order change. Originally, the phenomenology was supposed to be followed by a section on logic and other disciplines. However, due to the complexity of logic, Hegel decided to publish it as a separate work, this current book. Structure of logic. The book you're reading focuses on Doctrine of Being, Book 1, and will be followed by Doctrine of Essence, Book 2, and then Subjective Logic, Volume 2. Future works. Hegel also mentions plans for further publications on the concrete sciences of philosophy of nature and philosophy of spirit. Overall, this passage highlights that while Hegel's logic is a separate book, it's a crucial building block for understanding his entire philosophical system. Preface to the second edition 12. I have tried to remedy the imperfection of its treatment in the first edition. Difficulty of the subject. Hegel acknowledges the inherent difficulty of the topic of logic and its explanation. Imperfections of the first edition. He admits his previous attempt at explaining logic wasn't perfect, even though he has been working on it for years. Need for reader's indulgence. Hegel asks for the reader's understanding due to the complexity of the subject and his own limitations in explaining it thoroughly. Problem with traditional resources. The existing resources on logic and metaphysics haven't been helpful. Lack of focus on speculative side. Past works haven't emphasized the deeper philosophical meaning of logic. Repetitive and uninspired. Existing material is either superficial or simply rehashes old ideas. No philosophical depth. These traditional approaches haven't contributed to a deeper understanding of logic's philosophical significance. 13. To exhibit the realm of thought philosophically, that is, in its own immanent activity. Need for a fresh start. Hegel emphasizes the need for a completely new approach to studying logic. He wants to present the realm of thought in its own dynamic process, immanent activity, and necessary development. Importance of traditional material. Despite the limitations of existing works on logic and metaphysics, Hegel acknowledges their value as a starting point. Familiar forms of thought are seen as a foundation to build upon. He calls them a necessary condition and a presupposition to be gratefully acknowledged. Limitations of traditional material. However, Hegel criticizes the traditional material as meager shred or a disordered heap of dead bones. This metaphor suggests the existing knowledge is fragmented, incomplete, and lifeless. Lenin. Excellent. 14. The forms of thought are, in the first instance, displayed and stored as human language. This passage highlights the deep connection between language and thought in Hegel's philosophy, specifically in the context of logic. Here's a breakdown of the key points. Language and thought. Language is seen as the primary way humans store and display forms of thought. Thinking itself is what separates humans from animals. Logic is humanity's natural element. When we internalize ideas and concepts, language becomes involved. Everything we express through language contains a category, a basic concept either hidden, mixed with other ideas, or clearly defined. In this way, logic is considered humanity's natural element, and even our peculiar nature. Logic and transformation. Logic, by shaping our ideas and purposes, transforms our raw experience of the world, sensation, intuition, etc., into something uniquely human. However, this transformation might be formally human at first, meaning it provides a basic structure for our understanding. Importance of language specificity. Languages with specific terms for logical concepts, prepositions, articles, are seen as advantageous. Chinese is mentioned as an example of a language lacking this development. Substantives and verbs. It's even more important for a language to have logical categories expressed as nouns and verbs. Substantives and verbs. This stamps them with the form of objectivity and makes them more substantial concepts. German language and logic. Hegel praises German for having many advantages in this regard. He even mentions some German words with opposite meanings, suggesting they reflect a speculative spirit by uniting opposites in a single word. This might seem nonsensical to those who rely solely on basic understanding. Philosophy and terminology. Philosophy doesn't need a special, invented vocabulary. Borrowing words from other languages is acceptable, especially if they've become established in philosophy. Focusing on precise meaning is more important than language purity. Scientific progress and language. As culture and science advance, new and more complex relationships of thought come into use. Even basic sciences like physics use common categories like whole and parts, which become more widely recognized. Overall, this passage emphasizes how language shapes our thinking and how specific languages can be better suited to express logical concepts. Hegel argues that logic is not separate from language but rather intertwined with it, and that a well-developed language can even reflect a speculative spirit through its vocabulary. Lenin, the connection between thought and language, the Chinese language, incidentally, and its lack of development. 11. The formation of nouns and verbs. 11. In the German language, words sometimes have Entgegengesetz Bedeutung. 15. In physics, the category of force has become predominant, but more recently polarity has played the leading part. On the development of scientific thought in Hegel's perspective. Shifting categories in physics. The passage uses physics as an example of how scientific understanding evolves through categories. The concept of force was dominant, but recently polarity, opposing but interconnected forces, has taken a leading role, even if sometimes overused. Moving beyond abstraction. This shift is seen as a positive development because it moves beyond simple abstraction, focusing on a single concept like force. Importance of difference and inseparability. The concept of polarity emphasizes difference, opposing forces, but also their inseparable conjunction. They are interconnected. This is a more nuanced understanding than just focusing on one isolated concept. Specificity in science. Studying nature requires considering the specific categories, fixed categories, that are relevant to natural objects. Scientists can't ignore these established categories. Science versus generalities. Unlike some philosophical approaches, science doesn't simply move towards abstract generalities. It has to consider the specific oppositions and complexities within natural phenomena. In essence, this passage highlights how scientific progress involves using more complex and interconnected categories to understand the natural world. It avoids oversimplification by acknowledging the difference and inseparable conjunction of forces within natural phenomena. 16. While logical objects may be thoroughly familiar to educated people, it does not follow that they are intelligently apprehended. Understanding versus intelligent grasp. Even though educated people might be familiar with logical terms and use them in everyday language, Hegel argues this doesn't necessarily mean they truly understand them intelligently. Familiarity breeds impatience. People might get impatient with revisiting familiar concepts like logical categories. The aim of the foreword. This preface aims to explain the process of going beyond mere familiarity with logical concepts. Philosophical thinking versus natural thinking. The passage highlights the difference between basic, everyday thinking and the deeper, philosophical approach to understanding. Goal achieved. Hegel believes the foreword, along with the introduction, has provided enough background information for readers to grasp the concept of logical cognition before diving into the detailed explanation of the science itself. In essence, this passage concludes the introduction by acknowledging the challenge of presenting complex ideas to an audience already familiar with the basic terminology. It emphasizes the need to move beyond superficial understanding and engage in a more philosophical mode of thinking about logic. 17. The forms of thought have been freed from the material in which they are submerged. The significance of separating logic from everyday thinking and its historical development according to Hegel. Here's a breakdown. Abstraction as progress. Hegel sees it as a major advancement that human thought forms, universalities, have been separated from the material of everyday experience. This material includes things like self-conscious intuition, perceiving things directly, figurative conception, using imagery to understand, desires and willing, influenced by emotions. The role of Plato and Aristotle. Hegel credits Plato and especially Aristotle for being the first to focus on these thought forms, universalities, for their own sake, making them objects of study, contemplation. This is seen as the beginning of truly understanding logic. Aristotle's historical observation. The passage quotes Aristotle saying that people only pursue philosophical knowledge, like logic, after basic needs and comforts are met. This suggests that focusing on pure thought requires a certain level of leisure and freedom from daily concerns. Egypt as an example. Aristotle is also quoted mentioning the early development of mathematics in Egypt. Hegel might be implying that a stable society with a leisured class allows for the cultivation of abstract thinking like math and logic. In essence, the passage argues that separating logic from everyday experience is a crucial step in understanding thought itself. It highlights the historical importance of Plato and Aristotle in this endeavor and suggests that focused study of logic is a luxury that requires a certain level of societal stability. 18. The need to occupy oneself with pure thought presupposes that the human spirit must already have traveled a long road. The idea that studying pure thought, which is the foundation of logic according to him, is a privilege and requires specific preconditions. Here's a breakdown of the key points. Pure thought requires a long journey. Engaging with pure thought isn't something people can do right away. It presupposes a long road of intellectual development for the human spirit. Silence and self-reflection. Studying logic necessitates entering a silent region of thought. This refers to a mental state focused on introspection and free from the usual concerns and desires that drive everyday life. Interests which move the lives of races and individuals are hushed. Luxury of abstraction. Hegel argues that this focus on pure thought is a kind of luxury. It requires a need of the already satisfied need for necessities. In simpler terms, people can only pursue logic after their basic needs are met and they have the freedom to abstract from the concreteness of daily life. Freedom from material concerns. Studying logic requires a state of abstraction from the material, which includes intuition, direct perception, imagination, concrete desires, instincts, and will these material aspects of our experience are seen as veiling the underlying logical structures, determinations of thought. In essence, this passage emphasizes that studying logic is a demanding intellectual pursuit. It requires a level of mental discipline, freedom from daily concerns, and a shift towards introspection and self-reflection. 19. It is customary to include logic in the curriculum of youth, not yet involved in the practical affairs of life. Aristotle on freedom through knowledge. The passage quotes Aristotle again, who argues that the science which is not studied for its utility, like logic, is the only absolutely free science. This suggests that studying pure thought offers a kind of intellectual freedom not found in practical pursuits. Hegel seems to agree, calling it a more than human possession. Logic versus other philosophy. While other areas of philosophy deal with concrete objects like God, nature, and spirit, logic focuses solely on thoughts as thoughts. It's about understanding the underlying structure of thought itself, independent of its specific content. Logic for young minds. The passage mentions the traditional practice of teaching logic to young people. This is seen as appropriate because they are not yet burdened by the practical affairs of life and have the leisure to focus on pure thought. This reflects the historical context where young students from privileged backgrounds had more free time for intellectual pursuits. Logic as a tool. Hegel seems to disagree slightly with Aristotle's view that logic is not essential for practical pursuits. He suggests that understanding logic can be a valuable means for future engagement with practical interests. However, he acknowledges that logic is still a theoretical exercise, theoretically even with these. Schooling and logic. Overall, the passage suggests that studying logic is a necessary preliminary labor best undertaken in schools. It provides a foundation for future practical and intellectual endeavors. In essence, this passage positions logic as a gateway to intellectual freedom and a valuable tool for future pursuits. It acknowledges the historical context where studying logic was a privilege of the young and leisured, but also suggests its broader potential for anyone willing to engage in the silent regions of thought. 20. In life, the categories are degraded to serve in the creation and exchange of ideas. The difference between how we use logical categories in everyday life, natural logic, and the approach he advocates for in his study of logic. Here's a breakdown. From pure thought to everyday use, the passage argues that logical categories, once contemplated for their own sake, as discussed earlier, get degraded in everyday life. They become mere tools, used in communication and intellectual exercises. Categories as abbreviations. Logical categories function as shortcuts, abbreviations, due to their universality. A single concept like war can encompass a vast array of specific details. Focus on content, not logic. In everyday use, the focus is on the content being discussed, e.g., war, love, God. The logical categories themselves are not seen as playing an active role in shaping that content. Natural logic versus Hegel's logic. This everyday approach to logic is called natural logic by Hegel. He seems to find it limited because it doesn't recognize the active role of categories in shaping our understanding. Thinking as subordinate. When logic is seen as a mere tool for other mental activities, like analyzing content, then thinking itself becomes subordinate to those activities according to Hegel. Feelings versus categories. The passage uses feelings as an analogy. We don't see ourselves as using feelings, but rather as being possessed by them. Similarly, most people aren't aware of consciously using logical categories. Universality versus particularity. However, unlike fleeting feelings, logical categories offer a sense of universality that aligns with our sense of freedom as human beings. We might feel trapped by emotions, but logic offers a path to understanding that transcends specific situations. In essence, this passage criticizes the uncritical use of logic in everyday life, natural logic. Hegel argues that logic is more than just a tool. It plays an active role in shaping our understanding of the world. He positions the study of logic as a path to intellectual freedom and a deeper grasp of the universe. 21. It is our thinking that must accommodate itself to notions, and our caprice ought not to want to mold them to suit itself. This passage by Hegel delves deeper into the challenge of recognizing logic's power in shaping our understanding. Here's the breakdown. Difficulty of accepting logic's power. Hegel acknowledges the difficulty of accepting that the categories of logic, which permeate all our thoughts, might actually control us rather than the other way around. Universality of logic. These categories are seen as universal, existing beyond any specific feeling, impulse, or will. We might feel like individuals with free will, but logic operates on a more universal level. Freedom through logic. Interestingly, Hegel suggests that the path to freedom lies in understanding these universal categories. By studying logic, we can escape the limitations of our immediate feelings and grasp a broader perspective. Nature of things and logic. The passage uses the concept of a thing's nature or essence as an example. We can only understand these through thought, logic, and these concepts themselves are not subject to our whims. In simpler terms, the way things truly are isn't something we can just decide or invent. Thinking must adapt. Hegel argues that our thinking must ultimately accommodate itself to the true nature of things, not the other way around. We can't just force our ideas onto reality. In essence, this passage emphasizes the power of logic as a universal structure that shapes our understanding of the world, even though it might feel counterintuitive to our sense of individual freedom. Studying logic is seen as a path to intellectual freedom by allowing us to escape the limitations of our immediate experiences and grasp the underlying structures of thought and reality. 22. We cannot go outside our subjective thought, and just as little can we go beyond the nature of things. Our thoughts and the nature of things. Hegel argues that our subjective thoughts and the objective nature of things are deeply intertwined. Our innermost act of thinking shapes how we understand the world, objective notion of things. Limits of knowledge. We can't truly escape the limitations of our own thinking, go outside this our act. Similarly, we can't fully grasp the essence of things themselves, go beyond the nature of things. Ignoring the nature of things, however, Hegel seems to suggest that focusing solely on our subjective thoughts wouldn't be helpful either. This would make our understanding entirely self-referential, with no connection to the external world. Critique of critical philosophy. Hegel might be criticizing a philosophical school called critical philosophy, possibly referring to Kant. He argues that their view, which sees our thoughts as a barrier between us and the real world, is flawed. Things as subjective thoughts. Hegel seems to suggest that the idea of things existing completely separate from our thoughts, beyond us, is an illusion. He argues that even the concept of a thing in itself, an unknowable essence, is ultimately a product of our thinking, figment of subjective thought. In essence, this passage presents a complex view of knowledge. Hegel argues that our thoughts and the nature of things are interconnected. We can't have pure, objective knowledge, but studying logic can help us refine our understanding of the world through the lens of our own thought processes. He criticizes approaches that see thought as a barrier to understanding, suggesting instead that a deeper analysis of thought itself is the key to knowledge. Lenin, in my opinion, the essence of the argument is 1. In Kant, cognition demarcates, divides nature and man. Actually, it unites them. 2. In Kant, the empty abstraction of the thing in itself instead of living gang, Bugung deeper and deeper of our knowledge about things. Divides versus unites. You correctly identify that Hegel criticizes Kant for seeing cognition, the way we know things, as creating a division between nature and humanity. Hegel believes cognition actually unites us with the world by allowing us to understand it. 1. Empty abstraction versus deeper knowledge. Your interpretation aligns with Hegel's view of the thing in itself in Kant's philosophy. Hegel argues that this concept is an empty abstraction that hinders knowledge. He suggests a more dynamic approach, living gang, Bugung, to understand how our knowledge about things deepens over time. Additional points. Hegel emphasizes the role of logic, categories of thought, in shaping our understanding. By studying logic, we can refine our ability to make sense of the world. Kant believed there was a fundamental, unknowable reality, thing in itself, that existed separate from our experience. Hegel rejects this idea and suggests reality is mediated through our thought processes. 23. To focus attention on this logical nature which animates mind, moves and works in it, this is the task. The passage discusses the difference between instinctive and intelligent acts, arguing that intelligent acts are what set humans apart. Here's a breakdown of the key points. Instinctive versus intelligent acts. Most of our thoughts and actions are driven by unconscious natural logic, similar to instinct. We focus on the content, not the thought process itself. The importance of thought. The passage argues that true understanding comes from recognizing the notion or universal concept behind things. This immanent universal is what makes something fundamentally what it is. Humans and universals. By grasping these universals, humans achieve a higher level of being. This is what separates us from other creatures who may be driven purely by instinct. Freedom through awareness. When we become aware of the thought processes behind our actions, the logical nature, we achieve true freedom. We are no longer limited by immediate desires and can think critically. Instinct binds us. If we remain reliant on instinctual thinking, we are stuck in a fragmented world dictated by our basic categories. True understanding comes from stepping outside this framework. In simpler terms, the passage says that just going through the motions isn't enough. Real intelligence and freedom come from understanding the why behind our actions and the universal concepts that shape our world. Lenin, and Hegel draws attention to thoughts of all natural and spiritual things, to the substantial content. 18. To bring into clear consciousness this logical character, which gives soul to mind and drives and operates in it, this is our problem. This part of the passage builds on the previous section by emphasizing the importance of understanding the logical character behind both natural and spiritual things. Here's what we can glean: universals in everything. Hegel isn't just talking about human thought processes. He suggests there are underlying thoughts or universal concepts that govern both the natural world, think laws of physics, and the spiritual world, think moral principles. Substantial content. This refers to the core essence of something, beyond its immediate appearance. By understanding the logical character behind something, we grasp this deeper meaning. Our task. Hegel emphasizes that our goal is to bring this logical character into clear consciousness. This means actively questioning and analyzing the underlying principles that shape both our internal world, thoughts and feelings, and the external world, nature and society. Analogy: imagine looking at a painting. We can appreciate the colors and shapes, but a deeper understanding comes from knowing the artist's intention and the historical context. Similarly, Hegel argues that true understanding comes from recognizing the logical character behind the surface of things. 24. Here and there in this mesh there are firm knots which give stability and direction to the life. The concept of spirit and its relationship to knowledge. Here's a breakdown. The mesh of existence. Hegel uses the metaphor of a mesh to represent the complex web of thought and experience that makes up spirit. Imagine a net with interconnected threads. Firm knots. Within this mesh, there are firm knots or nodes that provide stability and direction. These represent key concepts or ideas that are essential for understanding spirit. Becoming self-aware. The importance of these knots lies in their self-awareness. They have been brought to consciousness and are no longer just unconscious instincts. They become independent and self-existent notions of spirit's essence. The crucial relationship. The most important point, according to Hegel, isn't just the abstract nature of spirit, what it is in itself, or its actions, what it actually is. It's the relationship between what spirit thinks it is and what it actually is. Why is this important? Hegel emphasizes this because spirit is essentially consciousness. Self-knowledge is a fundamental part of what makes something a spirit. In simpler terms, this passage argues that true understanding of the self comes from examining the key concepts that guide our thoughts and actions. These knots or core ideas become even more powerful when we bring them to conscious awareness and compare them to our actual experiences. This ongoing reflection allows spirit to truly know itself. Lenin. In this web strong knots are formed now and then, which are foci of the arrest and direction of its life and consciousness. 18. How is this to be understood? Man is confronted by a web of natural phenomena. Instinctive man, the savage, does not distinguish himself from nature. Conscious man does distinguish. Categories are stages of distinguishing, i.e. of cognizing the world, focal points in the web, which assist in cognizing and mastering it. This passage clarifies the concept of the firm knots within the mesh of spirit or consciousness, discussed earlier. Here's how it connects to the previous ideas. Man versus nature. The passage introduces the distinction between instinctive humans, the savage, and conscious humans. The web of nature. Just like the previous metaphor of the mesh, here we see the world presented as a complex web of natural phenomena. From instinct to understanding, the savage doesn't distinguish himself from this web. He reacts instinctively to his environment. On the other hand, the conscious human being actively tries to understand the world. The role of categories. These firm knots are now referred to as categories. These categories are the tools we use to distinguish things from each other and understand the world around us. They are like focal points that help us navigate the complex web. Gaining mastery. By developing these categories, we gain the ability to cognize and master the world. We can not only understand it but also interact with it more effectively. In simpler terms, imagine looking at a forest. An instinctive person might just see a mass of trees, but a conscious person will categorize the trees by species, size, and location. These categories become knots in the web of their understanding, helping them navigate the forest and potentially use its resources. 25. The loftier business of logic is to clarify the categories and raise mind to freedom and truth. The development of categories and their role in achieving true understanding. Here's how it connects to the previous ideas. Categories start raw. Initially, categories exist as mere impulses. They are instinctive reactions to the world, not fully formed concepts. From separate to connected, these initial categories enter consciousness separately. They are like isolated points not yet connected into a system. This leads to confusion and an incomplete understanding of reality. Fragmentation and uncertainty. Because these categories are not well defined and interconnected, They can only provide a fragmentary and uncertain actuality. Our understanding of the world is limited and unreliable. The role of logic. This is where logic comes in. Hegel sees logic as the loftier business of clarifying and refining these categories. Logic helps us define categories clearly. By examining and refining these initial impulses, we can develop clear and well-defined categories. Connect the dots. Logic helps us see the relationships between these categories. They become a system, not just isolated points. The goal: freedom and truth. Through this process of refining and connecting categories, logic helps us achieve freedom and truth. Here, freedom refers to the ability to think critically and not be limited by fragmented understanding. Truth refers to a more complete and accurate grasp of reality. In simpler terms, imagine a child first encountering colors. Initially, they might just see red and blue as separate things. But as they learn and develop, they understand the relationships between colors, shades, mixing, and can describe them more accurately. This is what Hegel is saying about logic and categories. It helps us move from a basic, fragmented understanding to a more complete and nuanced one. 26. In its negation, the true is associated with limitation and finitude, its untruth and unreality. Critique of the traditional view of logic and highlights the importance of his concept of notions. Here's a breakdown of the key points. Traditional logic versus Hegel. Hegel is critiquing the traditional view of logic, which sees categories, notions, as separate forms, distinct from the content they represent. Inadequacy for truth. Hegel argues that this approach is flawed because it presents categories as finite and limited. However, truth, according to Hegel, is inherently infinite and ever-evolving. Limited categories cannot capture this complexity. Truth and limitation. The passage clarifies that truth can involve limitations, but these limitations are a part of its ongoing development, not its ultimate state. Think of a seed. It's limited in its current form, but it holds the potential for infinite growth. Focus on affirmation. Hegel emphasizes that logic should focus on the affirmative aspects of categories, their potential for revealing truth. Neglecting their role in understanding the infinite nature of truth makes logic miss the mark. In simpler terms, imagine looking at a tree. Traditional logic might just categorize it as plant. But Hegel argues that the category plant itself is a dynamic concept, with the potential to encompass all the variations and complexities of plant life. Logic.